Welcome again to another edition of IDS Hour. I'm your host, Paul Honeycutt, joined as always by Geoff Volker. Geoff, the last 4 episodes we've been doing on the nation of Israel, we primarily looked at how the New Testament defines the nation of Israel. Today we want to start looking at some of the Old Testament prophecies that relate to the nation of Israel. One of our longtime well-known pastors has always made the argument that any prophecy made in the Old Testament about Israel must be literally fulfilled. We would probably take issue with that. And why don't we look at some examples?
You're quoting John MacArthur.
I didn't want to use names.
Yes. We always name names. You know, that's the Apostle Paul named names. We name names. John's a faithful, wonderful guy. But on this issue, we do differ. Mm-hmm. That's true. So go to Romans chapter 9. So what we're going to do is look at prophecies in the Old Testament that are regarding after God gets done judging Israel, then he's going to bring them back into the land and cause them to believe. Now, this particular prophecy is quoted all throughout the prophets. So you pick it up in all the prophets. We're going to and let me sort of make note that there are 7 or 8 places in the New Testament that quote these prophecies regarding the regathering of Israel back at the end, and then they become believers. So this prophecy is quoted in one form or another about 7 or 8 times in the New Testament. We are going to survey those instances, and then we are going to see if I think they uniformly are fulfilled spiritually in the church, not literally. And we will discuss all of that as we walk through them one by one. First one, Romans chapter 9. Now, typically we go to Romans 9 to talk about election, predestination. God chooses those who are going to be saved. But that's not our discussion today. We're going to pick it up in verse 22. The Apostle Paul seems at this section to be answering the question, why would God choose individuals? Why would God, let me rephrase that, create individuals that he has no intention of saving? Mm-hmm. The reprobates, the non-elect. Okay. I think this section, verses 22 and following in the book of Romans, chapter 9, answers that question. So Paul says this, what if God, choosing to show his wrath and make his power known, bore with great patience the objects of his wrath prepared for destruction? That would be the non-elect. What if he did this to make the riches of his glory known to the objects of his mercy, whom he prepared in advance for us, whom he prepared in advance for glory, even us, whom he also called, not only from the Jews but also from the Gentiles? As he says in Hosea, I will call them my people who are not my people. I will call her my loved one who is not my loved one. And it will happen that in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, they will be called sons of the living God. So we read from verses 22 to 26. Now, the basic idea is pretty straightforward, that the non-elect have a role to play in the saving of the elect. And when their role is done, hell begins. I know that sounds kind of cold-hearted, but I think that is exactly Paul's argument. So, taking me for an example, as far as I know, I was the first believer in my family line. So my father and mother, both of their lines are strong Roman Catholic. I would say exclusive Roman Catholic. They go way back. So as far as I know, I was the first believer in my family line. Now, I have one other brother who is a believer, who's a wonderful believer, but that's it. So, but my point is that all of my ancestors, and I had another brother who did a remarkable genealogical work, tracing our ancestry back both from my father's side and my mother's side, but all of these ancestors, who, as far as I know, were not believers, they were just traditional, strong Roman Catholics, so they're the non-elect, but they had an absolutely indispensable role to play in my salvation. because if I had to come through their line, in order to be born. And so they were indispensable for my salvation. It's just their role to play wasn't positive for them. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, I can't take any credit because I was exactly just like they were. And for some reason, which I don't know, the Lord decided to choose me and give me the faith to believe and change my heart, but I can't take credit for any of that. So, but the fact that my ancestry, unbelieving ancestry, was indispensable to my salvation is true. Mm-hmm. I think that's what Paul is getting at. That's his argument, which is why he has the non-elect have a role to play in his saving of the elect. So, and that's pretty straightforward here in Romans 9, but I want to focus on at the very end. So he says, how he has, verse 23, what if he did this to make the riches of his glory known to the objects of his mercy, the elect, whom he prepared in advance for glory, even us, so Paul's talking about believers now, whom he also called, not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles. As he says in Hosea, I will call them my people who are not my people, and I will call her my loved one who is not my loved one. Now, my point is, if you're just reading this in a straightforward manner, so he's saying God is going to save not only Jews, which is not surprising that he saves Jews. Salvation historically always comes through Israel. But he's also going to save Gentiles. Up to this point, he hasn't been saving Gentiles. And then he quotes Hosea. He quotes both Hosea chapter 2, verse 23, and then the very next verse, Hosea chapter 1, verse 10. And we'll look at both of those. But he says he saves not only Jews, but also from the Gentiles, as he says in Hosea, I will call them my people who are not my people, and I will call her my loved one who is not my loved one. Now, you would say, well, who were the not my people? Well, it was the Gentiles. Of course, it's kind of obvious. And they are now going to become his people because he's going to choose to save some of them. Well, that's pretty straightforward. And you say, well, now I understand what Paul's getting at. The problem that exists is, of course, if we go back to the book of Hosea, to the original context, we're going to find out that the Apostle Paul is not talking about Gentiles, but only Jews. Not the Apostle Paul. The Lord, in his prophecy to Hosea, in its original setting, is only talking about Jews. Mm-hmm. So how do we explain that? And so let's turn back to Hosea, which is the first of the minor prophets. Go to Hosea chapter 1. Now, the book of Hosea is not a difficult book in the minor prophets, because we are given a recounting of Israel's history through this sort of drama acted out by Hosea the prophet, mm-hmm. and he's told to marry this wayward woman, immoral woman, Gomer. And of course, Hosea is going to stand for God, and Gomer is going to be the picture of Israel. And the idea is Israel's always going astray, so Gomer is always getting involved in immorality, and Hosea keeps loving her in spite of that, and that's how God is now dealing with Israel. Throughout their history, they go astray. He shows them love. They go astray. He helps them out, but they go and shows them love, but they go astray again. That's the whole picture, and that's the book of Hosea. So actually, the sort of the theme or overall plan of the book of Hosea is quite simple. Mm-hmm. It's just God's dealing with rebellious Israel throughout their history. Okay, so let's pick it up in verse 4. Okay, so then the Lord said to Hosea, okay, now verse 3, I guess I should say, so he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to Hosea, call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel. Now, we need to understand Israel's history a little bit. In around approximately 900 BC, the kingdom of Israel under Solomon dies, and his son Rehoboam is now king. At that point, Rehoboam, because of his actions, the kingdom is fractured. 10 tribes become the northern kingdom of Israel, and the southern, just a couple of tribes, become Judah, and one other become the kingdom of Judah. And so you have this split, this in Israel, and of course that's what in the book of Hosea, now they're addressing the northern kingdom first, because the northern kingdom always was bad. Southern kingdom became, mostly bad, but has some good kings. But in the north, every king was bad. Well, they're referring to verses 4 and 5 to the fact when actually God, God used Jehu. We'll keep that character, just put him out there, and he massacred the king of Israel's sons. Okay, well, now this says that God is going to put an end to the kingdom of Israel. And we know in 722 BC, the Assyrians came and they wiped out the northern kingdom of Israel. So that's sort of the backstory, what's behind the scenes. So then we pick it up in verse 6. Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. Then the Lord said to Hosea, call her Lo-Ruhamah, for I will no longer show love to the house of Israel, that I should at all forgive them. So in Hebrew, the word lo always means not or no, and not loved, Lo-Ruhamah. In verse 7 says, yet I will show love to the house of Judah, because they haven't gone as bad yet, and I will save them not by bow, sword, or battle, or by horses and horsemen, but by the Lord their God. After she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, Gomer had another son. Then the Lord said, call him Lo-Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Okay, now stop there for a second. What's going on is that the northern kingdom, when the Lord brought the Assyrians to sort of wipe them out, God is now rejecting the northern kingdom. So they are no longer his people. Okay, and so you have that. Now, verse 10 says, yet the Israelites will be like the sand of the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, they will be called sons of the living God. The people of Judah and the people of Israel will be reunited, and they will appoint one leader and will come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. So now this is saying that even though God rejects them, they're not his people. I think Jeremiah says God divorces Israel. But there's going to come a time, yet future, when they're going to be reunited with Judah and brought back into the land. And they will become believers. Okay, well that's pretty straightforward. And once again, going back to what you brought up earlier, Paul, that MacArthur, who represents in this instance guys who are generally dispensational in their understanding of prophecies to Israel, is that a prophecy to physical Israel must of necessity have a literal fulfillment. Okay, and we have to admit that if we just had our Old Testaments, that we would agree with John MacArthur wholeheartedly. Mm-hmm. Of course we would, because that seems to be a rather straightforward sort of expectation. But that's, here we say, well, this is quoted in Romans 9, but it's not quoted with regard to Israel. It's quoted with regard to Gentiles. They were never the people of God. Now they're going to become the people of God, because God is going to elect some of them. Okay, and when he talks about the Gentiles being brought in, he quotes Hosea 1:10, which we just read. Then he quotes 2:23. So go over to Hosea chapter 2. Now, in this context, the text is in the form of poetry, but we'll pick it up but you'll see the same theme. It's just so repetitive in the prophets. So he's talking about a day in the future. In that verse 16 of chapter 2, in that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and you will no longer call me my master. I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked, because, of course, Israel was following false gods. In that day, I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the creatures that move along the ground. Bow, sword, and battle I will abolish from the land, so that all may lie down in safety. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice. In love and compassion, I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. In that day I will respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the skies, and they will respond to the earth, and the earth will respond to the grain, the new wine and oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. I will plant her for myself back in the land, that's Israel. I will show my love to the one I called not my loved one. I will say to those called not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. So what's this referring to? Well, at some time in the future, Israel has been rejected. They are not his people, the northern kingdom. And yet sometime in the future, he's going to bring them back into the land. And when he brings them back into the land, they will now say, you are my God. And God will say, you are my people. So they're going to become believers. Whoa. This is very straightforward. And as we've been reading from Hosea chapters 1 and 2, he's only talking about Israel's history. So with that in mind, now let's go back to Romans chapter 9. So what's going on? And initially, sometimes when you read the commentaries, it can be a little wild. But from our point of view, we would say, okay, the Apostle Paul is interpreting these Old Testament passages in Hosea, but he's interpreting them under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Therefore, we would say God is giving us his interpretation of these passages. Whoa. Well, that really is pretty straightforward. Now, the problem exists, though, is when you read this, how Paul is using these passages in Hosea about the regathering of Israel back in the land at the end. If that doesn't seem to fit into your theological understanding, then we would say, okay, we understand that, but that would mean then that I am not understanding correctly what's going on, or I'm not looking at this from the proper perspective. Because if I get the perspective correctly, what Paul says about the use of Hosea, these two passages, must make perfect sense. That's the point. And of course, since the Apostle Paul is guided by the Holy Spirit, therefore he is God giving us his interpretation of these prophecies to Israel. So then what would we come up with if we paid attention? We would say, or I would say, that the people of God, what we would call, we have physical Israel, which is always unbelieving except for a remnant. Now, that when God is talking about this prophecy of Israel coming into the land, this prophecy is quoted as being fulfilled in the new covenant era in the church, which is mostly all Gentiles with a remnant, small remnant of Jews. So then what you have is you have physical Israel functioning as a picture, unbelieving though it is, a picture of the real people of God. But the real people of God, the spiritual Israel, are made up of mostly Gentiles. So when Paul quotes both Hosea 1:10 and 2:23, and he's quoting the regathering of Israel back into the land, Paul quotes it in order to explain this surprising statement that God's not only going to save Jews, which everybody knows that's what he does, but he's going to save Gentiles. Because it is the Gentiles coming in to faith that is virtually most of the church, except for a small remnant of Jews. So you have the prophecies about the regathering of Israel at the end, and then Israel believing, when, at least in Romans 9, in all fairness, when that's quoted, it's quoted as being fulfilled in the New Covenant era, from Pentecost to Second Coming, because this is, Paul is describing what is going on now. He's not talking about the end, he's talking about now. This is what's going on now. And that's what we see. So we see today that the church is mostly Gentiles, a little bit of Jews, and which is exactly what we would expect. So God is interpreting his own word. We would admit that if I just had the Old Testament, I would not be expecting this. But once I read this and God interprets his own word, it makes sense now. Whoa, physical Israel is an unbelieving picture of the real people of God. But the real people of God, the spiritual Israel, is mostly Gentile, with a little bit of Jews. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting. It begs the question, I suppose, when we've mentioned the name, so someone like John MacArthur, who is then in a sense looking for this restoration of the physical people of Israel, I assume in the physical land for that matter. So he's still looking for that. He still thinks that those prophecies, like in Hosea and others we'll look at, must literally take place. So then how does he view this passage and the church?
Well, the way at least it's typically understood from a dispensational perspective, it seems to me, is that they would recognize, because obviously MacArthur's committed to Scripture, he's a godly guy, you'd say, well, that the Gentiles coming in are a picture of what God is doing with Israel. They are only a small picture.
Is that the sort of the parentheses kind of thing? The church is a parenthetical age or something?
Yeah, and the problem is that he'll say, okay, he would recognize that what Paul says is absolutely true because it's Scripture, but this is only sort of a picture of the ultimate fulfillment in physical Israel being in the physical land, Palestine, and then physical Israel believing at the end.
Right.
Well, in theory, that is possible. We would recognize that, but we'd say, well, no, this is viewing this as this is what this means. End. See, that's the problem. The problem is there's no other, in the teaching passages of the New, the Apostle Paul is giving the rest of the story.
Right.
That's the problem.
And after the Assyrian, and then of course following that the Babylonian captivity, there was a time when certain Jews, a remnant of them I suppose, came back into the land.
Yeah, you have it under Ezra and Nehemiah, but a very small group. When they came back in the land, they didn't believe.
Right.
And then they in turn, and so they were unbelieving again, and they in turn then were eventually, the Greeks came, the Syrians, then the Romans, so they were just always under somebody's thumb, except for a few years during, what we would say would be the Maccabean revolt, but that's another discussion. You're right, so there does seem to be no way of viewing the return, that small return of unbelieving Israel under Ezra and Nehemiah back into land as a fulfillment of this. That doesn't seem to be possible.
Right, so then you've got to be still looking forward to that happening somehow in the future.
And of course then Paul quotes that in Romans. He's quoting Hosea as this is what's happening now. The Gentiles are being included. This is critical to the fulfillment of this prophecy. Of course, that did not happen before. This was unique in history, only taking place in the New Covenant era. Because initially it strikes you strange, I think, in all fairness. It really does, because it catches you up. But actually, I think once you understand Israel is that temporary unbelieving picture of the people of God, then it makes sense. Well, of course, now, because they're not the real people anyway, so the fulfillment is a spiritual Israel, and most of those spiritual Israelites are going to be Gentiles.
Mm-hmm.
So when Paul is in Romans 9, he's talking about God is going to save Jews as well, and also Gentiles. And he quotes Hosea to explain that. So then you have to conclude, well then, physical Israel is a picture of spiritual Israel, and spiritual Israel is mostly Gentiles. Ta-da.
Which is the church today.
Yes.
All right, well, next time we're going to continue this. We're going to look at some additional
we're
old in the new versus old in the old.
We are going to relentlessly walk through these quotations in the new of the prophecies regarding the regathering of Israel back to the land, because we want to make a real statement that this is uniformly
right.
how God interprets these passages.
Got it. Okay, well, as always, if you have questions or concerns or whatever, feel free to contact this guy here, Geoff Volker.
Sure. My cell number is 480-313-8558. My email address is volker.jeff@gmail.com. My Skype name is Geoff Volker with no space in between. I'm easy to find. You want to talk and interact, that'll be great. We can start with the email, but we'll probably continue on phone or Skype because I'm not into long emails. But I'm more than glad to talk with you. And if you don't agree, you're welcome to call. And because at the end of the day, we want to be biblical. That's what we want to be. And I'm not assuming that we're always right. I think we're right, but that's all I can say.
We try to be right.
We try to be right. I think I'm right, but I've been wrong in the past. And but obviously I sound very confident in the present.
There you go.
So, but please raise the questions. Thank you.
And if you do think we're right and you'd like to support this ministry, there's information on the website where you can do just that. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.